The Silent Night Killer, a Carroll and Delaney short mystery. Part 1, by Jackie Sharp. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, events, incidents, and organizations are either products of the author's imagination or used fictitiously. Text and all formats copyright 2023 Jackie Sharp. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced in any format without written permission from the publisher and author. Chapter 1, December 17th, 1943. "Come on," he said, the lines around his eyes creasing as he grinned at her. "Just one drink, then I'll walk you home." "All right," Phyllis agreed, relieved that his good humor had returned. "I'm sorry about, you know." She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, suddenly feeling the soreness in her calves from standing for her 12-hour shift. He laughed and shook his head as if he'd forgotten the whole incident. Phyllis shivered and pulled her coat a little closer around her shoulders. The rain had started and puddles were forming on the pavement. It was late and even the trams had stopped running. The shops along the high street were shrouded in darkness and silence, except for the streetlight above them, dimmed to the regulation wartime glow. Phyllis shivered again, but this time a tingle of apprehension spread from her hairline down past her shoulders and into her aching back. In an instant, she regretted her impulsive behavior. "Look, maybe we could have a drink another time? I am quite tired." He laughed. "Come on," he said, ignoring her and grabbing her hand. "Just one drink." He swung her around to face him, and for the first time, Phyllis felt his strength, and she stared up at his face in alarm. His wide shoulders and muscular chest, which she'd admired and giggled about with the other girls at the factory, now stood in front of her like an ominous obstacle. She couldn't see his features in the shadows, but his voice had lost its teasing tone. Maybe he sensed her apprehension because he relaxed his grip on her hand and said softly, coaxing her now, "Did you not like your presents?" Phyllis felt a knot grow in the pit of her stomach. She'd been so tired of not having nice things, not being able to have fun, that she'd allowed herself to be charmed. She wished she'd walked home with Birdie as usual, because by now she'd be huddled under a blanket with a cup of tea and a good book. But she had accepted his gifts. It would have been rude to refuse his invitation, and one drink wouldn't hurt. "Well, just one then," she said hesitantly. "That's my girl." And just like that, his demeanor lost all its menace, and Phyllis's doubts evaporated again. They moved from street lamp to street lamp, the dull pools of orange from the hooded lights like stepping stones in a dark river stretching out in front of them. "Where are we going?" They came to a stop in front of Woolworth's. The shop had long since closed, and Phyllis glanced behind her, feeling anxious once more as she realized the street was deserted. "This way." He grabbed her wrist, making her cry out, and pulled her towards a dark opening between Woolworth's and the shop next door. "That doesn't go anywhere. That's an alleyway." Phyllis's voice rose in panic, and she pulled back, twisting her arm in an attempt to break his grip. "Let me go. You're hurting me." "It's a shortcut," he insisted, jerking her towards the rectangle of blackness. No, I've changed my mind. I want to go home." Phyllis was crying now, struggling in his hold, but he was too strong. He pulled her into his body and clamped her arms against her sides. Then, in a quick move, he turned her around, wrapping one arm around her neck, while the other hand crushed her nose and mouth, silencing her. Phyllis frantically tried to dig her heels in to stop him dragging her backwards, while her hands scratched at his arms, which squeezed harder as he pulled her into the alley. Her breath was coming in hard gasps, and her vision slowly dimmed, and her arms and legs fell limp as she felt her body being lowered to the ground. Then, for a brief moment, his hold on her loosened, allowing her to gulp in the sweet air. She mustered all her strength to reach out to find something to grab hold of, so she could somehow get away. But before she could move, she heard a grunt, and then he was looming over her again, this time his face close to hers. "Please," she croaked, but then his hand clamped around her throat and started to squeeze. She choked, and her hands flew up to try to make him stop. She dug her nails in hard and scratched like a furious alley cat at his flesh, but his grip tightened and tightened. Her lungs burned and her head throbbed. This can't be the end, she thought, just before she was swallowed forevermore into the darkness. Chapter 2, December 17th, 1943. That's grand, darling. Maggie Carroll ruffled the dark curls of one of her twin sons, who pulled away instantly, but with a smile that tugged at her heart. Yours too, Jimmy, she said to her other son, who was studiously working at gluing his paper chain. We'll have beautiful decorations this Christmas, won't we? Will there be presents? Patrick asked. Maggie got to her feet and delayed answering the question by prodding the smouldering fire in the grate and adding a few pieces of coal. As the fire spluttered back into life, she turned and faced her sons, a smile plastered on her face. Well now, there might be a present or two, but you know what will be more fun than getting presents. Her two sons shook their heads, frowning in unison, as if they couldn't think of anything more fun than receiving presents on Christmas Day. Making presents for other people. She stood with her hands on her hips and waited until the boys processed this new idea and then grinned up at their mother. What will we make for Birdie? Patrick asked. A box for all her jewels. James punched his fist into the air, delighted with his idea. That sounds very nice, Maggie answered in a serious tone, although she was quite certain that her daughter Bernadette didn't possess any jewels. Birdie will love that. I'm sure that Mr. Larkham will help you if you ask him politely. If George was here, he'd have loved to spend afternoons with his sons, tinkering in the garden shed, making Christmas presents for his wife and daughter. But he wasn't. Maggie's eyes went to the photograph of her husband, standing proudly in his army uniform, and felt the tears prick in her eyes. He was missing so much, but she was grateful for the kindness of the elderly man next door, and his obvious fondness for her sons. My late wife was Irish, Mr. Larkham had told her once. Listening to you makes me think of her, and she would have loved these two boys. That thought made Maggie smile, and she turned her attention back to the activity in the room. The diversion had worked. Patrick and Jimmy were no longer concerned about their own presence. Their dark-haired heads bent together, murmuring to each other in their special twin language, no doubt discussing plans for the construction of Birdie's box for her jewels. The room had darkened, the fire in the hearth casting shadows in the small living room. Time to cover the windows. Maggie got up and stretched before walking over to the small window, which looked out onto Patterson Road. Birdie would be home from her shift at the Royal Arsenal soon, the vast munitions factory that made bullets, guns and artillery shells. With most men enlisted in the forces, the arsenal employed thousands of women from Plumstead and Woolwich. Bernadette, Birdie, had insisted on working at the arsenal as soon as she was old enough. Maggie had resisted at first. It had taken a direct hit during the Blitz, and the thought of Birdie working inside that building terrified her. Maggie remembered only too well the way the skies were lit up orange and red above London. The rumblings, the sirens, and the clouds of dark smoke which hung over the streets for weeks afterwards. Maggie still had a metallic taste in her mouth and a knot in her stomach as she recalled the paralyzing fear of those nights, clinging to her babies in the Anderson shelter. What if the bombing started again and Birdie was trapped in the arsenal? She had argued with Birdie when she found out her daughter had applied for a job. She explained her concerns. What about the danger? What about the machines and the chemicals? She'd heard stories of women turning yellow from the chemicals they used in that place. But Birdie had replied with a stubbornness that equaled Maggie's own. Daddy is fighting the war. We have to do our bit. So Maggie had not stood in her way and instead had tried to get used to living with the anxiety she felt from the moment the front door banged in the early hours of the morning, all through the day until she saw Birdie turn into Patterson Road 10 minutes after the end of her shift. At least Birdie's supervisor, a lovely lady called Phyllis, usually walked to the top of the road with her, so she didn't have to worry about Birdie getting home safely. Maggie smiled as she saw a familiar dark figure turn the corner and hurry down Patterson Road. Maggie barely had time to wonder why Birdie was on her own, when the door opened and a gush of freezing December air accompanied Birdie into the hallway. "Ma, pull the blackout curtains," Birdie called as she took off her coat and hat. I could see the lights from the end of the road. Maggie quickly arranged the curtains over the window and turned to give her daughter a kiss on her cold cheek. "You're like ice, darling. I'll make some tea and warm you up." Birdie smiled at her brothers. "What are you two up to?" she asked. "Nothing," came the reply, and the two boys huddled in closer. "What's going on with those two?" Birdie asked as she followed her mother into the kitchen and sat at the table. "Oh, they're just deep into some mischief like always," Maggie told her as she filled the kettle and lit the stove. She didn't want to give away the boys' secret. "How was your shift?" "All right." Birdie's tone made Maggie turn away from the stove and look closely at her daughter. "What's wrong, darling?" she asked. "Oh, nothing really," Birdie replied, looking down at her hands clasped together in front of her. Maggie waited. It took a few moments. "Nothing's wrong. I mean, I have something to tell you." "All right." Maggie poured hot water into the teapot, swilled it out, and then measured out 2 spoonfuls of loose tea, trying not to appear anxious. She poured hot water into the teapot, got 2 cups and saucers, and placed them on the worn wooden table where all her children came for tea and advice, as well as family meals. "There's only powdered milk," she said, sitting down and waiting for Birdie to continue. "I'm going to the Christmas dance," Birdie blurted out. Her cheeks were red and she'd tilted her chin upwards in defiance. Maggie sighed. "Birdie, we've been through this before. You are too young. That dance is by Woolwich High Street and it's too rough. All those soldiers, it's not the place for nice girls like you." Birdie's chin sagged downwards, her defiance replaced with disappointment. "Ma, all the girls are going. I'm already left out." Birdie bit her lip. "What do you mean left out?" Maggie asked and reached out her hand, but Birdie pulled back. I'm just younger and they talk about things without me," she explained. "Ma, please, I want to go to the dance. I want to have some fun." Her tone turned from pleading to defiant. Maggie poured the tea. "I said no, Birdie. Woolwich is dangerous at night." Then she remembered. "Why were you on your own walking home? Where was Phyllis?" "Off having fun somewhere," Birdie huffed, turning her cup of tea round and around in the saucer. "It's Friday night. All the girls go out, except me. And Phyllis, she—" Maggie waited for Birdie to finish, but her daughter's words tailed off. Maggie softened as she took a good look at her daughter. Birdie looked so tired and dejected. Her auburn hair was pulled back from her pale face, and she could have passed for a woman much older than the 17-year-old girl she was. "Birdie, I'm sorry and I understand. I really do. When this war is over—" "It'll never bloody be over," Birdie yelled as she stood, jerking her chair back. "Or by the time it is, I'll be an old spinster, just knitting, like Auntie Margie." "Don't be silly, Birdie," Maggie said, almost laughing at the prospect. Birdie was so far removed from George's bitter elderly aunt, it was ridiculous. But her daughter was already out of the kitchen. "Come back and sit down, Birdie," she called out after her. Maggie listened as her daughter's feet clattered on the wooden stairs, and then she heard the familiar creak of the bedroom door. "Dear Lord, give me strength," Maggie muttered as she sat alone in the kitchen, her mind wandering back to when she was Birdie's age, back in Ireland before everything. That was yesterday, she chided herself as she pushed herself from the chair and busied herself making toast and dripping for the boys. Chapter 3, December 18th, 1943. "She didn't do it, sir." Chief Inspector Robert Delaney leaned forward to catch the words. The young woman sitting on the uncomfortable metal chair on the other side of his desk had composed herself enough to stop sobbing, but her voice was a hoarse whisper. A combination of grief and sleeplessness, Delaney supposed. He stifled a sigh, not wanting to appear unsympathetic, but he wished he hadn't ventured from his office when he heard the commotion at reception some 20 minutes earlier. He was about to speak when the girl buried her head in her hands and started crying again. Mrs. Berkeley, Delaney's secretary, opened the office door without knocking and walked in, carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea on it. Her rigid posture and pursed lips, combined with the fact that she hadn't used the bone china teacups, indicated her disapproval of the young woman in his office. Or maybe it was of him, undermining her authority in her very own domain of the Scotland Yard receptionist's office. 20 minutes earlier, the steely grey December afternoon had darkened enough for Delaney to switch on his desk lamp and then pull the blackout curtains over the small window in his office. As he had been adjusting the cloth to make sure not a crack of light was visible from outside, he'd heard the raised voices and had opened his office door to see what was going on. He walked, or limped, down the hallway to the reception. A wound from another war caused the damaged muscles to stiffen, especially in damp weather. When he arrived at the front desk, A woman, or a girl, really, was shouting and banging her fist on the desk. Mrs. Berkeley, a substantial woman in her 60s, whose sole presence was usually enough to deflect members of the public who she deemed unworthy of the detective chief inspector's time, was standing with her arms crossed, unmoved by either the woman's display of anger or the hysterical sobbing which followed. "What seems to be the trouble?" he'd inquired. "This young lady is leaving right now, Detective Chief Inspector." Mrs. Berkeley gestured towards the door. "I don't know how she got in." "It's all right, Mrs. Berkeley." Robert Delaney was tired. His leg was throbbing, matching the pounding behind his eyes. He should have left Mrs. Berkeley to deal with the situation, but something about the desolate sobs of this woman moved him. He limped around the desk and loomed over the crying woman. "How can I help you, miss?" He waited for the woman to provide her name. "Turner." She gulped with the effort to control her tears. The name rang a distant bell. "You lot said my mother killed herself. I'm here to tell you she did no such thing. Someone must have done this." She sounded indignant now. Turner. Delaney recalled the case, a middle-aged woman found hanging in her bedroom just a few weeks ago. The victim, Evelyn Turner, was found by her daughter, who now stood trembling in front of him. Uniformed officers were called to the scene, but the pathologist had deemed the death as suicide. Nothing suspicious, nothing to do with his department, just one more tragedy in a city that was almost broken by human suffering. Delaney stood to one side and held his arm out. "Come through, Miss Turner." "Detective Chief Inspector." Mrs. Berkeley had started to protest, but Delaney fixed her with an icy stare. "Bring the Turner case file through, please," he'd instructed, and then escorted Miss Turner to his office. And that was what she was doing now. Mrs. Berkeley set the tray of tea on Delaney's desk, and he could then see the manila file beside the cups. "Thank you, Mrs. Berkeley," he said, his tone dismissing her. The older woman turned without a word and marched towards the office door, shooting a dark look at the woman huddled on the chair. "She didn't do it, sir." Miss Turner repeated the words, this time with conviction. She picked up the cup of tea and held it close, but didn't take a sip. Delaney noticed her hands shaking and hoped she didn't drop the cup. It wouldn't lighten Mrs. Berkeley's mood. "Miss Turner—" "Emily," the woman interrupted. "Emily," Delaney continued, keeping his tone gentle. "I know it must have been a shock, but—" "She didn't kill herself," Emily Turner interrupted as she put down the untouched tea and looked at him, her eyes pleading. "There must be something." Her voice trailed off. Delaney picked up the file and flicked through, noting the autopsy report and the short conclusion. There were brief background notes on Evelyn Turner. Widow, 65 at the time of her death, one child, and she'd worked as a housekeeper. Cause of death was asphyxiation due to hanging. She'd used a piece of rope to fashion a noose and then stood on a wooden stool to reach the exposed beam in the bedroom. The stool was lying to one side in the only photograph in the file. No sign of a struggle, nothing out of place or missing. There was nothing there that would make Emily feel better or erase the image of her mother's hanging body that probably haunted her. But still, Delaney hesitated before he offered the official placatory words. It was natural to fight against the hideous reality that a loved one would rather choose death rather than staying with you. The last image of his beloved Elizabeth entered his mind. His skeletal wife begging him to administer a lethal dose of morphine to end her unbearable pain. Delaney shook his head to dislodge the thought. It had been just under a year, and it took considerable effort to conjure the memory of a younger, vivacious version of his wife. Not the shriveled husk of a woman tired of clinging to life that she became. "Sir?" Delaney looked up with a start, realizing he'd been lost in his own thoughts. "Was your mother particularly worried about anything?" he asked. "Financial matters, maybe?" Emily shook her head vehemently. "No, I would have known. We talked about everything, even money, since Dad died." "What about work?" Delaney pressed. She liked her job. Emily dabbed at her eyes. "She would never have left me, Mr. Delaney, Detective Chief Inspector Delaney," he said, automatically correcting her. "You see, Miss Turner, Emily, sometimes people, even the people closest to us, are thinking about things." He corrected himself. Sometimes people don't want to worry their loved ones with their burdens, and sometimes the burden gets too heavy to bear. "It wasn't like that," she yelled, and her angry outburst startled Delaney. "How can you possibly know that?" he asked, trying to keep the irritation from his voice. Emily's eyes began to fill with tears again. "I know because my mother was a religious woman. She was a practicing Catholic. She would never have killed herself because it's a sin. And now she won't get a proper service. She won't go to heaven. She won't even get a proper grave." She bent her head to sob again. Before Delaney could react, there was a loud rap on the door, and an officer in uniform poked his head through. "Sorry to interrupt, sir, but something has come up." "I'll be right there, Constable." As the man retreated, Delaney closed the file. "Miss Turner, the very best I can do is review the file, see if there is something we missed." "But—" He stopped and smiled at Emily as she raised her head and looked at him with hope in her tear-filled eyes. "I'm not making any promises. You may have to come to terms with this terrible thing. I'm so sorry." Emily Turner stood and smoothed the wrinkles in her worn coat before she held out her hand, and Delaney shook it. "I know you'll find something, sir," she said, holding her chin up and looking at him with her red-rimmed eyes. "I know you won't let me down." "Where are we going, Constable?" Delaney asked as he settled into the back seat of the Wolsey. "Woolwich High Street, sir." "What do we know so far?" Constable Billy Hunter paused as if to collect his thoughts, and then, as if reciting, gave me the facts. "Dead young woman, not identified as yet, found in an alleyway behind the Woolworths. Dr. Holberg is at the scene. That's all I have, sir." "Right, I'm afraid it sounds like the other two," Delaney muttered, half to himself. He thought back to the files on his desk and the lack of progress they'd made on those cases. If only he had more resources, maybe he'd have solved them by now, and then maybe this woman would still be alive. "They were both in the same borough, sir," Constable Hunter ventured. "Woolwich, a garrison town on the south side of the River Thames, was notorious for trouble. The streets were often filled with soldiers in training from the nearby barracks, blowing off steam before they shipped out to the front line. The women who lived there or worked in the weapons factory there often complained about being harassed. If that wasn't enough, American airmen were now stationed a few miles from the center of town, and the local constabulary had their hands full, especially on Saturday nights, as locals clashed with the wartime guests over the attentions of the young female population. In fact, Delaney had theorized that the first murder victim, a young woman named Josie Manning, had died as a result of a drunken fit of jealousy, as she was reported to have been flirting with the Americans before she was found strangled on Plumstead Common, just a mile and a half from this latest victim. However, Delaney discarded this theory when the second victim, Alison Bennett, was discovered just over a mile from the first. She was a good girl, a distraught George Bennett had fiercely insisted when Delaney had tentatively asked if his daughter might have socialized with airmen from the American base. A check into Alison's background confirmed her father's claims. Alison was a bookish young woman who regularly attended the Methodist church near her home. "She used to meet me every evening at work," her father had sobbed. "She walked home with me from the arsenal, and we'd chat about everything. She'd have told me if anything was wrong." Were these random killings? Certainly, violent crime was on the increase, and with the shortage of able-bodied men available, the police force was stretched thin. Now a third murder. Another file on Delaney's desk, another life snatched away, and more uncomprehending loved ones who would demand answers he couldn't give. "Any other similarities with the other victims?" Delaney asked from the back seat. He was impressed with Billy Hunter. The man had lost a foot in the war and been sent home, but as soon as he'd recuperated, he'd applied to the police force. His disability had meant he hadn't been posted as a beat officer and spent a good deal of time behind a desk, but he was smart and tenacious. The force had spent time and money adapting the Wolsey he was now driving with hand controls, meaning that not only Delaney thought the man was worth the extra investment, Delaney thought he'd make a fine detective and had asked for his secondment to his severely depleted major crimes team. "Not enough information yet, sir. If it is a murder, hard to believe it's a coincidence." Delaney grunted his agreement and looked out the window as Constable Hunter drove past Whitehall and turned south towards Westminster Bridge. "Can you hear something, Detective Chief Inspector?" Dr. Holberg asked as he straightened his back and stood upright beside Delaney, scribbling something in a notebook. "Carolers," Delaney replied. "They're at the front entrance." Delaney shook hands with Dr. Joseph Holberg. He was pleased to see him. Holberg was good at his job. No, better than good. He was the best. For over 10 years, he'd been the senior pathologist of the Metropolitan Police Laboratory and had worked with Delaney several times. He was methodical and meticulous. His was a world of studying the gruesome details of crime scenes and human remains. His evidence in court had proved the innocence of many men and women over the years and sent many more to the gallows. The two men stood together as strains of Silent Night, Holy Night reached them in the dismal back alley where the latest body had been found. Bloody Christmas, Holberg muttered, and Delaney knew exactly what he meant. It wasn't Christmas that offended Holberg, even though Delaney assumed the doctor was Jewish. No, it was yet another wartime Christmas. Another austere affair to be endured with rationed food, shortages of everything, no twinkling lights, no parties. For a moment Delaney was transported back to the Christmas before Elizabeth was ill, the night they'd laughed and linked arms as they shopped for toys for Robert Jr. Now Elizabeth was gone, Robert Jr. was somewhere in Europe, and Delaney was here in London, facing Christmas and another New Year in his empty house, still mourning his loss. Just like Emily Turner. Delaney thought of the grieving woman in his office earlier and then turned his attention to the dead woman at his feet and felt a physical, hollow pain in his stomach as he imagined her parents' pain when news of their devastating loss was delivered. He was so tired of all this suffering. There were so many families whose sole Christmas wish would be word their boys were safe or on the way home, and many more whose hope had already been extinguished. It'll all be over by Christmas. That's what everyone had said back in 1939 when the entire country had been swept along in patriotic fervor. We'll show Hitler. It'll be over in no time. Here they were, facing the fifth Christmas with weary resignation. Delaney sighed. Poor thing, Holberg said, misinterpreting Delaney's sigh and bringing Delaney back from his thoughts. What do we know? Delaney asked. Her name is Phyllis Heaton. I found her identification in her pocket, along with a small amount of cash. Whoever did this, he wasn't robbing her. How? Strangulation, I'm sure. I'll know more when I get her back to the morgue. Holberg answered Delaney's question before he could finish asking. And I believe she has been here since last night, Detective Chief Inspector. Is this one like the other two? Delaney was hesitant, not wanting the answer, even though he already knew what it was. I'm afraid so. Delaney gazed down at the dead woman lying on her stomach in the rubbish, with her head turned to the side. Holberg was holding a gas lamp, and Delaney heard it hiss as he crouched, illuminating the side of the woman's face. Delaney couldn't help himself. He flinched at her open, unseeing eyes and upper lip, which curled slightly as if she were snarling. See those marks? Holberg pushed aside the collar of the woman's coat with a pen to reveal purplish bruising on the side of her neck. Strangled with a rope of some kind? Or bare hands, Delaney guessed. Hard to tell, Detective Chief Inspector. Transport should be here soon, and I'll get a proper look tonight. But it's safe to say at this point that we have another murder on our hands. Dear God, 3 women in as many weeks, and not one lead, not one bit of progress. Did you find anything that might help? Holberg straightened up and held the lamp high, causing rustling sounds and movement as rats scurried away from the light. See all this rubbish? Almost impossible to tell if the killer left anything. Who found her? An inebriated gentleman from the pub over there. Delaney looked to where Holberg was gesturing and saw a gate he knew led to the back entrance of the King and Castle, a favourite haunt of British and American servicemen and the source of most of the call-outs for the local officers. When? Just a few hours ago, he was apparently taking a shortcut home. Late for his tea, he said. He tripped over her in the dark. Sir, Constable Billy Hunter was standing a few feet away, taking care not to tread anywhere near the crime scene. What is it, Constable? We have an address for the victim, sir. I'll be right with you, Constable. Delaney turned back to Holberg. Another bloody unsolved murder on the books, Joseph. Feels like we're not making these streets one bit safer, he said, not bothering to hide the bitterness in his tone. Dr. Holberg swung the lamp around, and Delaney blinked in the light. What is it, Robert? The doctor asked, dropping formalities and looking at Delaney in concern. It's not like you to be so defeatist. I just wish I were doing a better job at preventing, well, this. Delaney gestured to the woman lying at his feet. "You are not to blame for all the evil on the streets. We are all doing the best we can with the resources we have, old chap." With his free hand, Holberg patted Delaney on his shoulder. "I'll be in touch tomorrow." "Thank you, Joseph. Oh, there is something." Delaney turned back to face Holberg. "Do you remember the Turner case? A suicide?" Holberg thought for a moment. "Yes, I do." "Why, something wrong?" Delaney shook his head. "No, I think we got it right. But would you mind just giving the file another look, please, just in case?" Dr. Holberg nodded his agreement before he went back to attending to the dead body. Phyllis Heaton had shared a tiny flat in a quiet residential street in Plumstead. It begged the question, Delaney thought, as he rapped on the front door. Where was Phyllis going on Friday night? Woolwich High Street was not on her way home. Did someone, maybe the killer, invite her to the King and Castle? The door opened a crack and a nervous voice asked, "Who is it?" "What do you want?" It took a few minutes of explanation and Constable Hunter producing his warrant card before Christine Chatsworth, Phyllis's flatmate, let them in. In a sober tone, Delaney explained why they were there. Christine, a waif of a girl who looked no more than 15 years old, received the news of Phyllis's death in stunned silence. Her hand flew to her mouth when Delaney told her they suspected it was murder, and her whole body visibly shook. Constable Billy Hunter helped her to a worn sofa in the cluttered living room and then made a cup of tea in the tiny kitchenette. "You didn't think it strange that Phyllis didn't come home last night?" Delaney asked. Christine had wrapped both hands around her cup of tea, as if the warmth would stop her body from trembling. "I didn't know," she whispered, so softly that Delaney had to lean towards her to hear. "I have just come back from visiting my parents. I arrived this afternoon. I just thought Phyllis was at work." "Did she go out often? To the pub, maybe?" Christine looked shocked. "No, she almost never went out, especially after work. She was always so tired." "Where did she work?" "The Royal Arsenal. She was a supervisor, I think." "You don't know," Delaney pressed. "Number she wasn't allowed to talk about her work. They make guns and things for the war. Some of it is very secret. She was very serious about her job." "Can you think of a reason why she would be in Woolwich High Street?" Christine waved a hand as if the answer was in the air around her. "Number, I can't think of any reason. Except," Delaney pressed. "She sometimes walked the other girls home. You know, the girls who worked with her. Some of them are very young." "Can you think of anyone in particular?" Christine thought for a moment. "The only name I can think of is a girl called Bernadette. I remember because Phyllis said she liked to be called Birdie." It was late when Constable Hunter dropped Delaney outside his home. "It's Sunday tomorrow, Constable," Delaney said as he got out of the car. "Take some time with your family. I'll take the tram to the office." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. See you tomorrow at the office." Delaney's house was in darkness, silhouetted against the moonlight. Mrs. Jameson, his housekeeper, had dutifully pulled the blackout curtains over all the windows, like all the houses in the street. But to Delaney, even without them, his house always felt dark and empty these days. Delaney gave a silent prayer of thanks for Mrs. Jameson when the warmth of the fire she'd lit in the living room and the smell of soup greeted him as he hung up his overcoat and unlaced his shoes, placing them on the mat by the door. Elizabeth had insisted he keep on the housekeeper throughout her illness so he could continue going to work. He'd wanted to stay at home, jealous of even an hour that anyone else spent with his beloved wife. But Elizabeth had been right. Now Elizabeth was gone, he leaned on his work and was thankful for the daily purpose that prevented him from sliding into an abyss of grief and self-pity. After eating the soup he'd warmed on the stove, Delaney poured himself a stiff whiskey from his diminishing pre-war stash and sat gazing into the glowing embers of the fire. It was Sunday tomorrow. He would be in the office as usual. He'd never been much of a churchgoer, and since Elizabeth, well, he didn't see the point. He thought of his son, Robert, off fighting somewhere in Europe, and he sent a prayer for God to look over him. "You owe me that much," he muttered as he took another sip of his whiskey. He thought about turning the radio on for the BBC News at midnight. At the beginning of the war, he'd tuned in to the BBC Home Service broadcasts every night at 9 p.m, and again at midnight, hoping, like the entire population he supposed, for news of the end of the miserable business. Instead, his thoughts turned to the murder cases. There was something he was missing. 3 young women killed in seemingly random attacks. He and Billy hadn't found any links between the 3 of them, although it was very early days for the investigation into Phyllis Heaton's murder. Murders of young women were sufficiently rare, even in these violent times, that Delaney could not imagine the killings were coincidental. Tomorrow he'd follow up with the girl who Phyllis apparently walked home to see if she knew anything. Maybe tomorrow would be better, except it wouldn't. Tomorrow, despite being Sunday and officially his day off, he knew that Chief Superintendent Charles Walden would expect an update. Walden was a legend at Scotland Yard. He'd climbed through the ranks, made Detective Chief Inspector, the same rank Delaney held now, at the age of 35. He'd cracked several high-profile cases, and then, at the beginning of the war, he'd single-handedly dismantled a crude bomb at Piccadilly Circus, set by Irish radicals. He'd received the King's Medal for gallantry for that one. Walden was loud, brash, and fair. Delaney remembered what he said at Elizabeth's funeral. "The door is always open, Bob," he'd told him gruffly, gripping Delaney's shoulder. "I mean it. I mean it." After the second murder, Walden asked to see the case files. "You think it's the same killer, Bob?" he'd asked. "I do, sir." When Delaney had asked for more resources, more men, Walden had refused. "Can't spare a soul. There's too much going on. I need all the men I can get. Can't tell you too much, but we think we've got information leaks. Bloody spies everywhere. We think Irish radicals are working with the bloody Nazis. Sorry, Bob, you'll have to think creatively with this one." Delaney swallowed the last of his whiskey, feeling the satisfying burn at the back of his throat, and wondered just how he was supposed to do that. He'd awoken to the chimes of the mantel clock at 3 a.m. He'd staggered to his bedroom, wincing at the cold sheets, and had fallen into an erratic sleep, dreaming of dead women and choirs singing Silent Night. He woke again as the grey light of the December morning crept around the cracks of the blackout curtains, and he steeled himself for another day. Chapter 4, December 19th, 1943. "Good morning, sir." The Sunday before Christmas, and Mrs. Berkeley was already at her desk as Delaney arrived at Scotland Yard. It had been light enough for him to see Big Ben showing 8 o'clock in the morning as he stepped off the tram at Victoria Embankment. Like all of London, Big Ben's illuminated face had been dimmed since the start of the war. For some reason, the loss of the familiar beacon bothered Delaney more than the lack of festive lights. Mrs. Berkeley was clacking away at her typewriter, impeccably dressed as usual. Delaney was instantly aware of his rumpled appearance. He had hauled himself out of bed and had spent several minutes massaging his stiff leg before he could hobble to the bathroom. Mrs. Jameson had left him a clean shirt, but he'd only splashed his face with cold water, and hadn't bothered to shave before he'd left to catch the tram. "Good morning, Mrs. Berkeley. Not at church this morning?" Delaney hadn't intended it as a rebuke, but realized as soon as the words came out that his prim secretary might interpret the remark that way. "I attended the early service and then came straight here, sir," she replied calmly, her tapping not faltering in the slightest. "Thank you for your dedication, Mrs. Berkeley. Today will not be a day of rest for this department, I'm afraid." "No, sir, those poor women." Mrs. Berkeley so rarely commented on cases it made Delaney stop and stare at her. "Yes, well, I'll do my best to catch the monster responsible," he said quietly. "I'm sure you will, sir. I'll bring your tea in a minute." Constable Hunter arrived and followed Delaney from the reception to his office. Delaney spread the files out on the desk and gestured for Constable Hunter to sit down. Billy leaned forward expectantly, with his pencil poised above an open notebook. Before Delaney could start, Mrs. Berkeley arrived with 2 cups of tea, balanced on a tray, and a manila envelope under her arm. "A messenger from Dr. Holberg's office just delivered this," she said as she placed the tray on Delaney's desk. Dr. Holberg must have worked through the night. The envelope contained a preliminary report on Phyllis Heaton, accompanied by some grainy photographs. Delaney sat back and read it carefully, trying to understand the impact of Holberg's medical findings on the case. "Right, Constable. Holberg confirms that Phyllis was killed on Friday night. She was strangled, evidenced by the burst capillaries and tiny hemorrhages on her face and brow. The killer had squeezed so hard, his thumbs had left bruising on Phyllis's neck." Constable Hunter interrupted. Didn't Josie Manning have similar bruising? Delaney nodded. Holberg has already compared the bruising and is certain we are dealing with the same man. Definitely a man, sir? Delaney took a deep breath and exhaled slowly before he answered. If it were only Alison Bennett we were dealing with, I wouldn't be so certain. But both Josie and Phyllis were well-built women and quite tall, and it takes a great deal of strength to squeeze the life out of someone, holding them down while they're thrashing about. They both fell silent for a moment, processing the horror of the situation. Anything else, sir? Holberg thinks Phyllis fought back. There was blood and skin under her fingernails. Whoever did this will have nasty scratches, probably on his hands or arms. That's something, sir, Hunter replied, a note of optimism in his voice. It will be when we finally catch him, Delaney agreed, as long as we find him before they heal. What do you have, Constable? I checked at the Royal Arsenal after I dropped you off. They work all night, so I found a foreman who knew Phyllis. She was well liked, good at her job. In fact, she had recently been promoted to supervisor and was respected by her shift workers. He didn't know if she had a boyfriend. Her shift finished at 5 o'clock on Friday, and she clocked out as usual. After that, he didn't know anything. Billy Hunter looked up from his notes. He was quite upset, sir. It seemed genuine. Delaney nodded. Good work. And this Bernadette girl, Birdie? Billy consulted his notes again. Bernadette Carroll. I have an address for her. Chapter 5, December 19th, 1943. Maggie hadn't stepped foot into a church since she was a young girl in Ireland. She occasionally felt a stab of guilt for not instilling religious discipline into her children, but then reassured herself that she and George had raised kind, well-behaved offspring who respected others without needing regular Sunday visits to St. Joseph's. But right now, Maggie wished her daughter could spend 2 hours this Sunday listening to the priest drone in Latin and then confess her sins, because Birdie's mood was like a black cloud over the household. Birdie had arrived home after work on Saturday, and immediately she and Maggie were arguing. "Why are you walking home alone again?" were the first words out of Maggie's mouth when her sullen-faced daughter banged through the front door. "Because Phyllis wasn't at work today," snapped Birdie, "and I'm perfectly fine walking home alone." They'd fought once again about the Christmas dance. "All the girls are going," Birdie had pleaded. "They say the Americans are perfect gentlemen, not like the soldiers in Woolwich. And there'll be gifts like candy and nylons." "Candy? What's that?" "Never mind, you can't be taking gifts from boys you don't know. It's not respectable behavior, Birdie. But it doesn't matter because you are not going to that dance, and that's the end of it." Maggie had got the last word, but Birdie had stormed upstairs and refused to come down for tea. This morning, Maggie and Birdie had barely exchanged 2 words, and even the boys were bickering, as if infected by the sour feelings filling the house. When there was a knock at the door, Maggie was relieved at the distraction. Maybe it would be Mr. Larkham, offering to take the boys for the afternoon. It wasn't Mr. Larkham. Maggie's stomach churned when she saw a policeman and another man standing at her front door. "Oh Lord, is it George?" The words stuck in her throat, but she forced them out. "George? No, no. Nothing like that," the policeman replied, obviously understanding the reason for her distress. "I'm Constable Hunter, and this is Detective Chief Inspector Delaney. We'd like to have a word with Bernadette Carroll. Is that you?" "Bernadette? Delaney?" Maggie was confused, but the name Delaney was ringing a bell. She looked at the other man, and there was something familiar about him. Something about that direct gaze, those blue eyes. He gave a start, as if he too was experiencing the same feeling. "Maggie," he said slowly, as if dredging the name from the depths of his memory. "Maggie McVeigh." Delaney sat in the armchair across from Maggie McVeigh. He hadn't seen her in 20 years. The last time had been in Ireland. It was at the end of the Civil War, a short, brutal affair, and his last assignment with the British intelligence forces. He was part of a small elite group, their mission to gather intelligence on the Irish Republican Army and disrupt their operations. His unit was called the Dublin District Special Branch, or D Branch, but they called themselves the Cairo Gang because they often met at the Cairo Café in Dublin. They were all ex-British Army, demobbed after the First World War with exceptional skills, but little local knowledge. Delaney had been the one to recruit Maggie McVeigh as a local undercover operative. She'd been working as a secretary at the Dublin Castle Administration in the British headquarters, but it was immediately obvious to Delaney that she was intelligent, observant, and, most importantly, able to hide in plain sight. Maggie's intelligence had been invaluable. D Branch had been one of the most effective units in the history of the British intelligence services until Sunday 21st November 1920. Bloody Sunday. 18 members of D Branch had been under surveillance for several weeks, their cover entirely blown. On the morning of Saturday the 20th of November, meticulously planned assassinations of the Cairo gang began at 28 Pembroke Street in Dublin. The IRA moved from location to location, killing the British agents until there were 14 dead men. One died later in hospital. Delaney could have been one of them. As it was, he was wounded badly, taking a bullet to the leg. If it wasn't for the quick intervention of Maggie McVeigh, who had discovered the plot at the last minute and was able to warn some of the officers, Delaney would have died too. She smuggled him out of Dublin, talking her way past a group of suspicious IRA members who thankfully were too distracted by their mission to question her too closely. She had put her life on the line. Delaney had lost touch soon after the rescue mission. An uneasy truce was negotiated in 1921, and the severely depleted Cairo gang was dismantled. Delaney sent back to England. He'd always wondered what became of Maggie McVeigh, and to his amazement, here he was, sitting in her living room. Bernadette was the image of her mother, the same auburn hair and pale Irish complexion, with blue-green eyes and a serious expression. She sat quietly as Constable Hunter explained why they were there, and then watched as her face contorted in horror at the news of Phyllis's death. Maggie was equally shocked. She wrapped her daughter in a long hug until the girl's crying subsided. Then she sat holding Bernadette's hand while she fired questions at Constable Hunter. Where had Phyllis been killed? How? Why had she been out alone? Did they have any idea who could have done such a terrible thing? If it hadn't been for the sad circumstances, Delaney would have been amused. Maggie hadn't lost her edge, he decided. Birdie didn't appear to know much. She'd planned to walk home with Phyllis as usual, but at the last minute, Phyllis changed their plans. She had a meeting, she'd said. She didn't say where or with who, and Birdie didn't question her. After all, Phyllis was older and her supervisor, and it was none of her business. So Birdie had walked home alone. When Phyllis didn't show the next day, Birdie didn't know why, and nobody said anything. What about work? Delaney asked. Phyllis had a lot of new responsibility. Was there anyone who was jealous? Birdie shook her head vehemently. No, everyone loved Phyllis. She looked after us. Can you tell me what you do at the Royal Arsenal? Birdie bit her lip and shook her head. No, sir, we can't say anything. It's for the war. Phyllis was very strict about that. Delaney nodded. And Phyllis didn't seem worried about anything? Something going on at home? Birdie shrugged but didn't say anything further. There wasn't gossip, Delaney pressed, about Phyllis? Maybe talk of a boyfriend? Not that anyone told me, Birdie insisted. And yet there was something behind the girl's eyes. Something that told Delaney that Birdie knew something, but he decided to leave it for now. Thank you, Bernadette. You've been very helpful. Birdie asked to be excused, looking from her mother to Delaney, and Delaney saw no good purpose in continuing the interview. After getting her agreement that she'd talk to them again if needed, he asked Hunter to wait for him in the car. Maggie and Delaney sat in awkward silence until Birdie's footsteps had disappeared upstairs and the front door had clicked shut. Maggie, it's so nice to see you, Delaney murmured, the words sounding completely inadequate. You too, Robert. Your leg? I see you are limping. She sounded genuinely pleased and concerned at the same time. It's fine, just fine. She's a fine young woman. You must be so proud, Delaney said. Oh, we both are. Birdie is just the apple of her daddy's eye. And I have 2 boys too. Twins. At that moment, Delaney heard the sounds of running feet coming from the room above. They're a handful, Maggie said, smiling. How about you? 1 son, Robert Jr. He's at war. Maggie nodded, immediately somber. My husband too. It's hard, isn't it? Your wife must be so worried about your son. Ah, my wife passed. Just about a year now. She was very sick. The words sounded strange, unfamiliar, and he wondered if he'd ever get used to telling people his wife was dead. "Oh, Robert, I am so sorry." Maggie had changed since he last saw her. Her Irish accent was softer than he remembered, and she was still so youthful. He compared her unlined face and just a hint of grey in her hair with his own craggy reflection that he saw in the mirror each morning. "Oh, it's all right. I'm getting used to it." His words sounded feeble. He wanted to ask Maggie so much, but it seemed inappropriate somehow after all this time. He ventured one question. "Do they know?" Maggie knew what he meant. "Not everything. I left most of Maggie McVeigh in Ireland. I was a hunted woman for a while. By both sides." She said it matter-of-factly, without a trace of bitterness in her voice. "I'm sorry, I never knew." "Oh, it's fine. They cleared me quickly, but after that I just wanted to leave. So I came to London, met George, and left it all behind." One last question he had to ask. "Do you miss it?" George, and left it all behind. One last question he had to ask. "Do you miss it?"